discussion about disaffiliation. So before I do that, just a few housekeeping notes. Let me welcome you here on behalf of the SPPRC, and I want to acknowledge them. If members are here, will you please stand? They've worked hard and very diligent in terms of putting this meeting together, along with the questions and the handouts. And let me also say thank you for those of you who showed up for the meet and greet breakfast, and I particularly want to acknowledge Diane Cooper, who spearheaded the effort, along with Barbara Goree, who we cannot do without, and also Ray Jones Jr. for the coffee. Ray, do you want to stand up and give a 30-second infomercial about your coffee? That is the best coffee on the planet. All right. And just so you know, the meet and greet was actually a challenge. It started with the SPPRC, and we are challenging other ministry to do the same either every other month or next quarter. So the SPPRC, we are challenging the choir. We're passing the baton to the choir to be the host of the next informational meet and greet excuse me, not informational, but just meet and greet breakfast. And so choir, ball is in your court, whatever day you choose. Yeah, exactly, as long as it's a Sunday. And without further ado, let me welcome our district superintendent, Jessica Rooks. If you could give her a warm round of applause. And may we call you Jessica? All right. And from that, before we get into the meeting, let me just give you some basic information and ground rules. One, I want to start with some definitions of terms you will hear throughout the presentation, and they are traditional and inclusive. And we are using those terms, traditional, to reflect the current standing as upheld by the United Methodist Conference in terms of its compliance with the church discipline. We are using the term inclusive for those who see it otherwise and want to engage and involve the practice of ministers, marrying, and so forth. So the two terms are traditional and inclusive. We also have your handout in front of you. So the format will be, we have a series of questions, and we have asked several of the church members to facilitate those questions. And we're going to perhaps spend about 5 minutes on each question. And I'm actually going to set a timer. So if you hear the buzzer go off, I'm going to have to be bad cop, and we're just going to wrap up those questions. And in the end, if there still are any thoughts or concerns that you still may have, just let me know, because some of you had some questions that may differ from the questions we have presented. But however, we strongly feel that the questions that we being the SPPRC, have worked on are very comprehensive. So with that, I would like to, yes, Ron Green. Correct. Yes. Yeah, again, this is an informational session, and no one has formed any position, no disposition, and the church is not moving in any direction regarding this matter. This is for informational purposes only. Again, this session is for informational purposes only. The church has not taken any action or moved in any direction regarding this matter. So with that, I want to give first Reverend Smith the chance for an opening statement if he chooses, and then Superintendent Jessica a chance for an opening statement if you so choose. Reverend Smith?
Thank you. I think my opening statement has been made. want to start mostly by saying thank you for inviting me to come and be a part of the conversation. The Mountain Sky Conference as a whole has 6 churches who are engaging in the disaffiliation process right now, getting ready for October's annual conference. We think all 6 will finish and will vote on disaffiliation. That's 6 out of 300 plus churches in our conference. None of those are in the the Mile High Metro District. None of them are Denver metro area. So if anyone asks, we have 6 churches that we expect will disaffiliate this year in our conference, which is a really, really small number in comparison to all the churches. There might be more next year. We don't know. It's this year's process. There's 6 who we expect to disaffiliate.
I'd also like to help you understand that this process can happen at any time you want it to. It's not that you have to have this done by October or next year. So this can be an ongoing process until we really have all the information you need.
So with that, we will start with question number 1, and I will set my timer.
Please kindly elaborate on the Mountain Sky Conference, MSC, position of non-compliance to the Book of Discipline. Why is their disposition acceptable, and is the MSC subject to further sanctions or disciplinary actions by the United Methodist Church?
I want to give it a little bit of background in order to answer that in the best way I can. General Conference 2019, it was a special general conference, special held general conference. And some of the language in these questions talks about that general conference upholding what had already been the case, what had already been the position of the Methodist Church. And to a point that's true, but it also created more restrictive rules than we had previously. So General Conference 2019 actually changed the Methodist Church rules and stance on homosexuality in some ways. It added automatic punishments without due process, which is not part of our Methodist heritage. If someone files a complaint against a clergy person, there's a whole process you have to go to. Reverend Smith has done that as a district superintendent. I mean, folks are innocent until proven guilty. General Conference 2019 changed the process for complaints against LGBTQ clergy or clergy who had officiated at a same-gender union to now have automatic punishments. So a lot of the response against General Conference 2019 was that the traditional plan, as it was called, in many ways wasn't Methodist. And it was passed, things were approved, that actually made it, clergy could steal from the church and be given more grace than a clergy who officiated a same-gender wedding, based on the laws passed at General Conference 2019. So when folks talk about being unwilling to comply, that non-compliance language, it was non-compliance to this new restrictive and what many thought were unchristian, non-grace-filled, non-Methodist rules that barely passed at General Conference 2019. So non-compliance became a way of saying, we could live under the previous Book of Discipline before 2019. We can't live under the current Book of Discipline post-2019. And conferences across the United States and in Africa and in Europe and in the Philippines all made statements of non-compliance. It wasn't just US, it was centric US. The majority of conferences, it was US. But there were Methodists across our denomination who said, we can't live with these new restrictive rules approved in 2019. So the Mountain Sky Conference was one of those conferences, and I think you see in your handout the petition that was passed in 2019 at annual conference, the non-compliance petition that the Mountain Sky Conference approved. I want to correct one thing. It says on this front page that Bishop Karen stated that 11 churches were out of order and non-compliant. That's not actually an accurate way of explaining that. Bishop Karen declared that 3 points of the petition were out of order. Never were any churches or clergy deemed out of order. Part of that petition went against the Book of Discipline. So she had to say that I think it was points 1, 2, and 4 were out of order. No churches have ever been declared out of order. I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. Our conference said we're not going to follow those punitive, really kind of non-Methodist new rules that were passed in the traditional plan in 2019. And so we said we would be non-compliant to those, to the restrictive, to the punitive, to the ways that targeted LGBTQ clergy or clergy who were allies, that we believed as a conference were unjust. We are not subject to further sanctions or disciplinary actions by the United Methodist Church. Conferences have a lot of autonomy. That doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. Conferences can't go rogue, as much as some try. We can't go rogue. We don't have total autonomy. But our non-compliance statement doesn't mean that we are subject to further sanctions or disciplinary actions.
Thank you. Yes, we have time for one question. Well, there's a microphone coming.
The non-compliance is with the punitive actions or whatever. How about the discipline stating that no self-avowed, where are we on that? Where is the Mountain Sky Conference on that?
So that's a great question. After 2019, when so many conferences and Methodists declared non-compliance, folks realized that we couldn't go forward in this continued battle. And so there was a lot of work done to create a new way forward. I won't get into all the detail, but groups got together representing kind of all sides of the theological spectrum and arguments, and developed what we called the protocol. And it was going to be an agreed upon way that we moved forward. It was written to be legislation for 2020 General Conference, which we know never happened. It's still the legislation written for General Conference 2024. But in the process of that, folks agreed that annual conferences could live in this non-compliance place without others doing charges against LGBTQ clergy or charges against clergy who had officiated same-gender weddings. So conferences like ours have for years ordained gay and lesbian clergy and publicly ordained gay and lesbian clergy. This isn't new to our conference. We've been doing it, I don't even know how long. Less public decades ago than we are now. We're pretty open and public about it. So we are non-compliant in that way. We will ordain, the bishop will appoint gay and lesbian clergy, and we will not file complaints against clergy who officiate at same-gender unions.
Well, thank you. We will move on to AJ with question number 2.
All right. As stated above, the Mountain Sky Conference of the United Methodist Church has approved for the churches of our conference who may wish to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church a grace-filled and concise way of churches to disaffiliate. Please clarify, would disaffiliation be from the United Methodist Church or from the Mountain Sky Conference? In the further and simplified stated, if Scott is compliant with the 2019 General Conference decision and the Book of Discipline, why should we have to disaffiliate and suffer monetarily versus those who admittedly are non-compliant with the 2019 General Conference decision and Book of Discipline, and they suffer no monetary penalty at all and actually profit from those leaving?
All right, I'll do the first part and then the second part. Disaffiliation is separation from the United Methodist Church. Churches that disaffiliate are no longer United Methodist. It doesn't matter what annual conference you're a part of. If you disaffiliate from the denomination. And the church is no longer United Methodist. which means you have to remove the cross and flame, you have to remove all the signage, you're no longer a part of our insurance coverage, you have to get your own 501c3 standing. So you are an independent church, separate from the United Methodist Church. The disaffiliation process, it's really interesting. Churches who remain are not profiting from those who leave. The conference isn't profiting from those who leave. The disaffiliation paragraph is 2553. The legislation was supported and passed by folks who upheld the traditional plan. It's really kind of interesting. The folks who really supported, pushed it, passed it, are now the folks who are upset by it, which is this fascinating dynamic playing out across the denomination. But it was written so that churches that were leaving kind of paid what they owed to the conference. So if a church has any arrearages, if they have an outstanding balance for pension and health and insurance, they have to pay that in full before they leave. If they've received any grants in, I think, the last 5 or 10 years, they have to pay those back before they leave. The biggest amount is the pension liability. Every annual conference holds a certain amount, a dollar figure amount, to cover pension for retired clergy. It's a formula that happens at the general conference, and then they apportion it to all the annual conferences, and then the annual conferences divide it up between all their churches depending on which clergy have served, full-time, part-time, multiple clergy. I mean, it's based on the actual pastors that you have had at Scott United Methodist Church. So that figure doesn't go just into some fund that the annual conference uses or any other churches use. It goes to pay pensions for your clergy who have served Scott if Scott decides to disaffiliate. So the unfunded pension liability isn't a profit to the conference or to other churches. It's to make sure that folks are due what they earned by serving in the church. So it's not that those who stay are going to profit off of those who left. That's not the case in any sort of way. The conference will designate all those funds in whatever way they come in. If it's apportionment dollars, if it's your mission shares, that goes to the operating budget of the conference, like it does every year anyways. If it's pension liability, if it's medical and arrearages, that goes into those designated funds. I think, yeah, so that language of suffer and profit is kind of it's a misnomer. It's a misinformation on how all of that money goes and how it's used.
Any follow-up questions? We have a couple minutes on question number 2. Any follow-up thoughts? Could you speak about
so the property.
The building?
Part of 2553, that's the term we use. 2553, that's the disaffiliation paragraph. So we talk about 2553. 2553 creates room for negotiation between the church and the conference board of trustees. So you might be aware, many people are, some aren't, that if a United Methodist congregation closes, the property reverts back to the conference. There's a trust clause. So if a congregation ceases to be United Methodist, the property automatically goes back to the conference. The assets, the liabilities, everything goes back to the conference. Well, in 2553, we release the trust clause on property through this process. There's some negotiation. If there's a large remnant congregation, if there's a lot of people who don't want to disaffiliate, and we need to figure out what it looks like to create a space in a church for them who want to continue to be United Methodist, we might put a dollar figure on the church to buy out their property. If there's not a remnant congregation, if there's not a reason to negotiate, what we have done in the past is put a line, it's a legal connection where if they cease being a church after 10 years, the property goes back to the conference. You have it free and clear as long as you continue to function as a church. Any church, any denomination, we don't put any stipulations on how you are church. As long as you continue to be a church, property is yours after 10 years, whatever. If you sell it right away, I think it's 20% goes back to the conference. And so we're trying not to put a dollar figure. Some conferences are saying 50% of the value of your property. Others have said 15%. We didn't want to do an across-the-board amount because that could be burdensome for the churches. And so it's a property negotiation to release the property.
One
Thank
quick
you.
question.
We will,
I have one quick one right quick.
yes.
Does that mean that the discipline will be changed to reflect this new direction that people are hearing?
So that we don't know what is going to happen in General Conference 2024. That is when the discipline would be changed, but we can't say yet what that's going to be because we don't know how the vote's going to go. And if a lot of folks disaffiliate between now and then and go to the Global Methodist Church, that's going to change the vote count, the delegate count, and the makeup of delegates at General Conference, which could greatly impact how things are passed or not passed. So it's a great question, and there's no actual answer other than we don't know.
Question 3, Dorothy Wallace, do you have a mic?
Scott United Methodist Church has not yet queried its members about the traditional model currently upheld by the General Conference in 2019. Within the Mountain Sky Conference, will churches who choose to follow the traditional model be able to coexist with churches who choose to continue to operate in non-compliance to the Book of Discipline or the inclusive model?
So the Mountain Sky Conference is committed to remaining Big Tent Methodist. I don't know if you all have used that, heard that phrase before. You know, Methodist, we've talked about being the Big Tent Methodist. We have a denomination where folks across the spectrum on all sorts of beliefs can coexist together in one denomination. The Mountain Sky Conference is committed to continuing that. Very much believe John Wesley's stance, if we cannot think alike, let us love alike. We don't expect every church to believe the same, to think the same, to function the same. And especially now in the Mountain Sky Conference, we span 4 states, plus 1 church in Idaho. I get in trouble if I don't say that.
The Love Church.
The Love Church.
Our Love Child, yes.
Idaho. 1 church in Idaho, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and Montana. I mean, imagine the different cultures across those 4 states. From urban to suburban to rural. Montana and Wyoming have more, I think, cattle than people in one of those states. I mean, just the cultural difference. In those 4 states, we have churches whose primary language is Vietnamese, Spanish, Korean, English. We are not all alike, and we know it. And actually, the Mountain Sky Conference values that. We appreciate that. We want to continue that. So the bishop, the cabinet, the leadership is committed to telling folks there is no expectation that anyone falls in line with any set of beliefs, just like there hasn't ever been. We're going to have churches that are conservative, that are theologically conservative, who remain theologically conservative, and who remain part of Mountain Sky Conference. And we will work with them in the same ways that we have always worked with them. There are churches who are kind of on the extreme progressive, and we will work with them the same way we have always worked with them. The majority of our churches really are more moderate, kind of that middle. We have continued to function in Big Tent Methodism. What I say is we will continue to welcome folks who want to stay in a place where not everybody has to think the same. If you want to coexist, awesome, we want to coexist. If you want a denomination where everybody believes and agrees the same thing, we're probably not for you. Just being real about it. Mountain Sky Conference, absolutely, we will all coexist in a way that we have for a long time, and hopefully strengthen that and continue to live into that in a better way.
Thank you. Do we have any other, we have a couple minutes, any follow-up questions or thoughts? With that, I will reset my timer. And speaking on question number 4 will be Mrs. Jane Green.
This follows right closely with what we just finished with. Will the Mountain Sky Conference fully support Scott in its staffing assignment consistent with its decision? For example, since the bishop has explicitly stated that the Mountain Sky Conference will remain in non-compliant with the 2019 decision, should Scott decide to remain in compliance with the traditional model, will pastors be assigned accordingly?
So when the cabinet does our work for appointment season, we actually spend a week in December, it's a long week, oh my gosh, doing the audit in which we talk about every single church in our annual conference. I get about 2 minutes per church, unless there's issues, to report on all of our churches. And that leads us into appointment season, where then we spend a lot of time on the churches that are having clergy shifts. We look at theology, culture, the needs of the church, and we work to match a clergy person accordingly. Every single appointment, that's the priority. What are the needs of the church? Who is the church? Who are the clergy that could serve this church, where it's a life-affirming appointment both for the church and for the clergy person? The cabinet doesn't knowingly, and I will say knowingly because sometimes you don't know, the cabinet doesn't knowingly appoint someone to a church where there's a major theological mismatch. What?
I said, well.
Knowingly, usually. I mean, like anything, the cabinet doesn't get everything right every time. I mean, we have mismatches. We can speak to mismatches. There are mismatches. We don't knowingly do it. You don't go into it saying, oh man, this one's gonna blow up, we're just gonna count the time. You try to match the needs of the church with the gifts and graces of the clergy person. We have 2 new questions that we ask. Maybe they're not new, maybe you did this as well years ago. Every consultation I have with an SPR, I ask, are you ready for a cross-racial, cross-cultural appointment? And I say ready because folks will be like, oh yeah, I think we're open to that. I think that could happen. And I say, okay, how will you support them if they experience implicit bias and racism in your church? Oh, we don't know. How will you support them if they can't find safe community outside of the church? Oh yeah, we don't know. Are you ready for a cross-racial, cross-conference appointment? We have a conversation about that. And then I ask, are you ready for an LGBTQ clergy person? And it's a similar conversation. And I ask for honesty. Transparency, honesty. The worst thing we could do is have an SPR say, yes, we're ready, and appoint someone where the church isn't ready. So if a church isn't ready for an LGBTQ clergy person, we're not gonna appoint someone, because partly that sets up the clergy person for harm and for pain. And it sets up the church for harm and for pain. That's not the job and the work of the cabinet. I know there's this kind of fear, this misinformation that, I'll name it, the WCA, the Wesleyan Covenant Association, has put out a lot of misinformation. And some of the misinformation that they put out is that churches are going to be forced to accept an LGBTQ clergy person. That is wrong. That is not correct. It is a fear tactic that they are using to encourage churches to disaffiliate. You will not be forced to accept a clergy person where the match would be clearly a harmful situation for you in the church. And I don't just mean that about an LGBTQ clergy person. I mean, that's kind of any clergy person. We want to help churches grow, not kill churches. We're not going to force you to accept someone that we know from day one it's going to be bad. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yes, we have time for one question.
And we already have heard, and I've read that churches are losing members, not just for this challenge, but they're losing members, period. More people either after they've been through the COVID process, where they stayed at home and got comfortable worshiping on Sunday in their jammies, and not coming out, and churches are suffering right now. And so how are we going to grow, especially, I'm only concerned about Scott, how are we going to grow this church if we don't make an honest, legitimate effort to get people back in the building?
Let me jump in and address the first part of your question, Ron. And that is, it's our charge and it's our endeavor to not have any silent sufferers. So through the informational sessions, we've had 2 that are open, and the SPPRC is open to individual consultations, and we're also open to small group consultations. So the information and the opportunity to have your feelings be known or your concerns presented is out there. And so, again, it's our charge as SPPRC, and we have 9 members. Each one of us are charged to be ambassadors of information sharing. And we also know through the help of AJ that we also have a website, and the website is another tool for information sharing and just an anonymous way for folks to ask and answer questions. So with that, let me give one more question to Charlene, and then we will continue with the format.
Pardon my, I don't know if this is the right format. It's come to my understanding that we are not different races, and to continue using the language interracial is harmful. I think, that racial context is a hoax for suppression. We are not a different race from other people, so calling us interracial is a problem that I think really, really needs as much addressing as this other issue.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that, and we will take that under advisement as an SPPRC on how we want to move forward with that. I have heard that concern, and it's debatable. We have people on both sides, so I'm not saying, Charlene, that you're wrong. And we understand that we're all of the same species, Homo sapiens, and there's different types of Homo sapiens that are supported scientifically and perhaps biblically. But to that point, I will make note of that and not dismiss it, but table it for the sake of continuing with the discussion. And with that, and Jessica, you've done a good job of jumping into the question on finances, but I will give Deidre McGee the microphone and some latitude to modify the question or to speak on the topic of how disaffiliation will affect us monetarily.
Is it afternoon now? All right. Reverend Jessica, hello. My question is, will Scott United Methodist Church be forced to comply with the inclusive approach? I think we have hit on that. Could you speak into the mic? Oh, can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Will Scott United Methodist Church be forced to comply with the inclusive approach or disaffiliate at a monetary cost if it remains in the Mountain Sky Conference?
So let me just start by saying Scott UMC will not be forced to do anything. None of our churches will be forced to do anything. We are not in the, that's not what the church is about. That's not what the conference is about, is forcing churches into things. Every single church can make a choice to stay or disaffiliate. The Mountain Sky Conference is going to continue to function as it always has in this big tent Methodism model. We won't expect that everyone believes the same. We know that some churches are not yet ready for LGBTQ clergy. Some of the misinformation fear tactic is the WCA saying, if you stay, you're going to be forced to allow same-gender weddings in your church. If you stay, you're going to be forced to accept LGBTQ clergy. It's not true. That really is a scare tactic by the WCA to encourage disaffiliation. It is not the case. The conference has never forced clergy to say yes or no to any weddings. As a clergy person, we have the authority to say yes or no to any request for a wedding. Clergy cannot be required to marry someone. Churches cannot be required to say yes to a request for a wedding ceremony. It's just not how the church works. You don't have to, it's not an inclusive model or a traditional model. That's really not the accurate way of thinking of this scenario. The traditional plan passed in General Conference 2019, but it doesn't mean that some annual conferences are working under a traditional plan and other annual conferences are working under an inclusive plan. That is not how things are happening right now. Some conferences have said they're not going to comply with the restrictive and punitive rules passed at 2019, but we still function under the Book of Discipline. That's part of what it means to be Methodist. If you are okay staying in the Mountain Sky Conference, knowing that the Mountain Sky Conference does ordain LGBTQ clergy, and we don't punish clergy for officiating at same-gender weddings, which has been the case for decades, that hasn't changed, then Scott continues in the same relationship with the Mountain Sky Conference that it has had previously. There's no question, there's no forcing of anything. Scott can continue in its conservative beliefs. As a congregation, Scott could say to me, we are not ready for an LGBTQ clergy person. And I would say, okay, next conversation. I mean, we're not gonna force anything on the local churches. That would kill local churches. And that's not what we wanna do. That's not how this is supposed to work.
Yeah. Can I follow up on my question, please?
Yes, you may. And then
from what you just said, you have a congregation, and I'm not speaking of Scott, but I'm just saying a congregation, and say 70% of the people have no problem with those LGBTQ pastors or marrying. However, the pastor has a problem with it. So where do you draw that line? How are congregations supposed to come together as one, or will it always be a question of, are you going to send us a pastor where this is the direction he's going to? However, the congregation doesn't share that same idea.
That's a great question. So there is a difference in where the pastor has authority and where the congregation has authority. The pastor can choose to officiate any wedding, whether he or she says yes or no to a couple. I would say a pastor maybe shouldn't do a same-gender wedding in a building when they know the congregation is against it. Maybe not the best idea. I've talked with churches who want to be open to same-gender weddings, and their clergy are unwilling to officiate them. And so then they have had conversations about, is the clergy person willing to let someone else come in and officiate in the building? There are creative ways to have these conversations, and the answer isn't going to be the same for every setting. That's partly why it takes conversations like these, where the congregation comes together. In order to disaffiliate, you have to have 2/3% of the congregation approve it. It's not just a simple majority, it's 2/3. The idea behind that is you need to have a supermajority of your congregation who wants to disaffiliate. Otherwise, you're going to kill the church. And we're seeing this happening where some churches are pushing forward with disaffiliation when they might have 52% or 55%, and they're trying to get everyone to agree, and it's causing conflict, and it's splitting churches. And so, yeah, the church might disaffiliate in a year after all the folks who don't want to have left, and they've lost half their congregation. I've always heard, maybe you have too, pastors should never take a vote unless they know they have at least 80% on any kind of anything. I mean,
if only that could be true.
If you don't think you have some consensus amongst the congregation, you're creating conflict in some of these things. And so how to navigate that well is super important. But churches can make decisions about how they want to be. And sometimes the pastor says, well, then maybe I need a new appointment. It's not a good fit anymore. Or the pastor says, this might stretch me. Maybe this will be good for me. And continues to work together. And that's where hopefully you're in conversation with the district superintendent as a clergy person and as a church. Ron, I wanted to answer real quick your comment about people stay quiet and then the phone calls start the next day. That was perfect, because yes. And then we start getting the phone calls the next day too. So not only do I talk with SPR, but I talk with outgoing pastors. I talk with former pastors if need be. If I think that there's something that the SPR isn't telling me, or I just can't get a sense, we have other ways to not assume anything, but try to dig in for more information. I've had a pastor who said, an outgoing pastor who said, I think this church is ready for a gay and lesbian clergy. And when I met with SPR, they said no. And so, you don't take the outgoing pastor's word for sure, but you do get a sense from them if they think, well, yes, most of those folks on SPR aren't going to be honest with you. They can tell us that. So we have other ways of digging deeper, because you're absolutely right. That happens.
Deborah Martin, your follow-up question?
Thank you. You mentioned that we really don't want to destroy the church or change the church. I've always had a concern in the past on how the conference, makes the decision to pull a pastor away from a church and put them in another location. And is there any input from the congregation at all on who we will receive? I mean, we've had some wonderful fits and then some questionable fits. And I would just question, how is it we're literally surprised by some of the changes, and we're just shocked at moments when we find out a pastor's leaving. How much control is there for us, or is there control?
There's some, more on who you get than if your pastor leaves, unless it's a really bad fit. Then often the clergy is also asking for a move. When we identify a clergy person for a new church, that can be a surprise to the church that they're leaving. I mean, often, unless there's issues, unless both the church and the clergy person have said we're ready for a move, it can be a surprise. Every December, your SPRC fills out a piece of paper, and your clergy person fills out a piece of paper that says stay, go, either. We want our clergy to stay, to go, or we're open to either. And the clergy says, I want to stay or go, or I'm open to either. And then we ask questions, and there's all kinds of stuff. We've had times where both the clergy and the church have said stay, and the clergy's been moved. And usually that's for a really missional purpose. If we're going to move a clergy person, and it's going to be a surprise, it's because there's a need somewhere that we've identified that this clergy person they are the right need. There's a blow up in a church, and we need someone to go in and do some serious repair work, and they're just the right person. And we think we can identify someone for that outgoing church who can step in. After we have announced a move, the district superintendent meets with the Staff Parish Relations Committee. And the Staff Parish Relations Committee has a profile that I've asked them to fill out, a church profile. And there's, 7 or 8 questions, everything from budgets to values. Well, yes, it is 7 or 8 pages. Tell us about the community around you, about the neighborhood. What are the needs? What are some of the growing edges? Do you have a mission statement, a vision statement? What's helpful in a clergy person? What's not helpful in a clergy person? That's one of my favorite questions to ask, actually. And so there's a lot of conversation over that profile in an SPR meeting. And then that often goes even beyond the profile. And I use that conversation and that profile and what I know and have experienced about the church when we start coming up with names for the next pastor coming in. So it's a collaborative, a consultative process that we include the congregation in.
All right, thank you. Time out, it is halftime. And what I want to do is just take a pause and ask you Does anyone have any questions or thoughts about what we've covered so far? Because I don't want to get so far ahead that we lose that thought or that question in the conversation. So I saw, is there anyone who has, I just want to give everybody the opportunity. So we have two, and anyone else?
Where they at?
We don't have any, so we'll yield to Ron Green, and then we'll yield. Are you sure? You sure? Okay. Charlene? Oh, I'm sorry. We have one in the back, so we'll do Charlene.
Don't go home in labor, Ron,
Hold on.
with an undelivered speech.
Charlene, we will come back to you. So we will give it to Robbie, and then we will give it to Charlene. And Ron, you're more, okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. I tell you what, I'm sitting back here, and I'm trying to decipher what is being said. And my question is that, will the congregation, and I've heard this, but I really don't understand what's going on. Is it just the clergy that we have to be concerned with, or members in our congregation as a total? Or we just separating this out to just, if we get a new clergy, whether we're going to be able to accept them? Because see, seem like we're separating stuff out from members wanting to join our congregation opposed to just the clergy, the pastor, or whatever.
Reverend
So
Smith,
are we taking just one step at a time, dealing with the clergy right now?
Well, Jessica, you can handle that, or Reverend Smith.
The conflict within the denomination is about clergy. And so that's where the majority of the conversation is. The conflict is about whether LGBTQAI clergy can be ordained in our denomination, and whether clergy can officiate same-gender weddings, and those weddings can happen in our churches. That's the presenting problem, question, topic. And so that's what we are spending our time on. I would guess most churches say that they are welcome of any members. And everyone is welcome, gay, straight, black, white, old, young. Most folks would say everyone is welcome, can be a part of our congregation, can worship with us, can eat with us, can pray with us. The question is, can anyone lead the congregation? And that's where the disagreement is. And that's what a lot of this is coming down to.
Okay, so will the congregation have to vote on, will we have to eventually vote on that? How will this decision be made? Because we've had several meetings, and I don't see any outcome. I haven't heard any outcome on it.
Well, Robbie, in the end, I was going to speak again on the process. The process is that Reverend Smith has asked and authorized the SPPRC to gather information and to disseminate the information to the congregation. This is our second session, and based on your response, we will have a third session or individual sessions. After that point, the SPPRC will make a recommendation to the church council, and it is the church council's task to manage the voting process if they want a voting process. So we are in the information gathering and the information, or the process of informing all of the congregants. And again, we will make a recommendation to the church council, and the church council is responsible for the next step. So let me go ahead to Barry, and then we'll move on to the format. I got you.
Here come Barry.
I'm sorry. Pause, Barry, until we get a microphone.
I think it should be both ways. There's more sheep than shepherds. We follow. The sheep follow the shepherd. And we want a leader that we're all happy with. This is a tough deal.
Barry, you will never have a leader that everybody's happy with. That's impossible. Sorry, unless it's Jesus, and even Jesus had some sheep that weren't happy.
All right. Well, thank you all. Charlene, I'm going to pause and I will promise you I will get back to you.
I think it's relevant, though.
What?
So I don't.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
The
and ask your
Wesleyan
question.
organization, or could you tell me more about that?
The Wesleyan Covenant Association.
Uh-huh.
So the WCA formed out of some of the leaders of the most conservative-minded groups in the denomination. They're a subset. They're not officially United Methodist, but they are United Methodists who formed an actual nonprofit organization, the Wesleyan Covenant Association, to promote their point of view. Yes. They are the ones who have started the Global Methodist Church. So if you hear about this other denomination being formed, the Global Methodist Church, that is the WCA. They're anti-inclusion. Yes. People talk about them as if they're two separate entities. They're actually the same entity. Legally, they are the WCA and the Global Methodist Church. WCA is the parent entity of the Global Methodist Church. The Global Methodist Church launched this year, and folks who are disaffiliating can choose, churches that disaffiliate can choose to be independent, or you can reaffiliate with another denomination. AME, Global Methodist, Free Methodists. I mean, there are a number of Wesleyan Methodist denominations. Churches who disaffiliate can join another one or can remain independent. Right now, the majority of churches that have disaffiliated or are disaffiliating are going independent. Clergy can also disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church. Some are doing that and going Global Methodist. More clergy are going Global Methodist than churches are at the moment that we know of. So they are kind of the ultra-conservative, fundamental wing who have formed together, created the WCA and the Global Methodist.
Okay.
They do have a lot of money.
Yeah, pardon me, Charlene, but Jane Green has the next question. And I just want to keep us on point so we can get through the questions.
Here you go, Jane.
I think we've pretty much covered, can Scott defer all action until 2024 General Conference?
There's no action you have to do right now. There is nothing that any local church has to do at this moment. Churches are choosing to have conversations about disaffiliation. 6 of our churches are choosing to do the process, to complete the process. I think 8 started, 6 are going to complete. But you don't have to do anything. So there's really nothing to defer until 2024. We're all waiting for 2024. I mean, we're all assuming we're actually going to have a general conference in 2024. And then we're waiting to see what happens.
All right, thank you. Oh, question number 7 by JAW. So let me preface my question by saying thank you, Reverend Smith, for your message. And this is one that I've struggled with, and I've spoken to many of you, and we all struggle with this, is the difference between what we know as the traditional versus the inclusive. And for better or for worse, there's been a pulpit or perhaps a bully pulpit that those who favor the traditional are anti-inclusive, or that they are anti-LGBT. Thank you. So just for our own edification, and because it's going to help us personally and spiritually, can you talk about a biblical foundation on why an inclusive approach is appropriate and consistent with the Word of God?
So I'm going to start by saying that question's too big for 5 minutes. Oh my gosh, that was an incredible sermon. And it's even too big for that amount of time. But wow, that was an incredible sermon. A lot of this comes down to scriptural interpretation. I'm surprised how many folks don't know, because we haven't taught it. The word homosexuality was first used in the Bible in 1946. It's the first time that phrase, that term, that understanding was actually used in a translation. The Revised Standard Version in 1946 was the first time the term homosexuality was put into the Bible. Those biblical interpreters have since said it was a mistake. It was the wrong word. Yeah, the wrong translation. When the word homosexuality is used in the Bible, it is often in contexts where the actual stories, if you go to source language, if you go to the earliest scriptures in their original language, they are talking about temple worship sex, they are talking about pedophilia, they are talking about masters sleeping with slaves. That's the language that is used in the original context of Scripture. Well, when we talk about homosexuality, we're not talking in those terms. Not once in Scripture, when the term homosexuality is used, is it talking about two people in a loving, consensual relationship. Not once. And the folks who first used that term in the Bible have since said it was the biggest mistake and they had no clue what it was going to do. I think it was 10 years later they came out and said that was wrong, we should change it, and by then it became the norm. And folks began to talk about it as if it had always been the case, as if Scripture has always been against homosexuality, as if Scripture has always condemned LGBTQ relationships. Scripturally, that's not true. The original material, the original language, the oldest stories, when they talk about things that we now say as homosexuality, wasn't about same-gender relationships. And especially not in the context of our world today. So unfortunately, we, and by we I say big church, clergy, scholars, have done a really bad job in the last almost 100 years now, countering that message that started in 1946 when they first included homosexuality. But that word homosexuality in Scripture is less than 100 years old used that way. It's not orthodox. It's not 2,000 years old. Scripture does not speak against homosexuality in the way that we grew up thinking it did when you go back to the original stories. So many of us who know that, who have studied, who have delved into the original languages, who have spent time looking not only at these specific scriptures, but at the arc of the Bible, it is not against people. The Bible is not against people. The Bible is all about how we love one another. I mean, the greatest commandment, both in Old and in New Testament, is love your neighbor. Love God first, and it's that love of God that then leads us to love our neighbor and ourselves. That is the foundation of Scripture. This other stuff has gotten in the way that we know is not actually scripturally based in the oldest languages, the oldest stories. But it's really, really hard to say that to folks who for 50 years have believed this at their core. For communities who have taught this at their core. And so it is climbing an uphill battle. It is a mountain that seems so big to try to climb, to explain that the Bible isn't actually against the LGBTQ community.
Thank you. Charlene, our question number 8 by Milton Garland kind of speaks to your point. So we'll let Milton get his question in, and then I promise we will get back to you with a follow-up.
Okay, this is the final question on the formal agenda. Can Scott join another conference of the United Methodist Church that has chosen to adhere to the 2019 ruling of the General Conference and continue to operate using the traditional model and not suffer the costs of disaffiliation?
No. That's the basic answer. No. So churches can't join other annual conferences. That's not how our structure is set up. And there isn't conferences that are functioning under a traditional model and conferences that are functioning under an inclusive model. That's just not what's happening right now. A church can either remain United Methodist, which is the default. If you do nothing, you remain United Methodist. Or you can splinter off and disaffiliate, which is what some are doing who want to leave the United Methodist Church. It's not a conference by conference, it's at the denominational level. If you disaffiliate, you are no longer Methodist. If you stay, you are part of the Mountain Sky Conference, because that's just how our conferences are organized at this point.
Well, thank you. We have time for just some follow-up comments. And
I would like to
Charlene?
just say, in response to that and the way that Jessica just explained it, we had a history of black churches being part of a central conference. Thankfully, we got rid of that system. So there's another reason why we can't do that or go back to that right now. It's going backwards.
All right.
Anthony,
Our
George is handing me the
follow-up
microphone.
questions, we're going to make them, I'm just going to limit them for the sake of time, but Charlene?
So in my understanding, one of our problems is we're trying to build a rocket to the moon, but we're not calling on knowledgeable people to inform us of how to build a rocket to the moon. So first of all, I think we need knowledgeable people to come and talk about these concepts. You know, I mean, maybe knowledgeable is open to somebody's opinion, but we're just going on emotion and tradition as to how we form our belief. We're not educating ourselves about human.
You mean about about the LGBTQ
We're not educating
community.
ourselves about real.
So scriptural education,
Yeah,
medical.
that's just emotion.
all those things.
That's emotion and tradition. What's real? We're not educating ourselves about what's real. You know, like a person born blind is not cursed. There's something going on physically. We're not educating ourselves. We need to educate ourselves. And we are like, that doesn't even matter, apparently.
Well, let me speak on behalf of SBPRC to the best of my ability, is that I think we do have knowledgeable people as presenters, and there's the way that church operates and the way that the church moves forward in its messages and its actions and its inactions are to support the church's mission, the church's vision and the church's mission. And that's not saying that we can't color outside the lines, but we are limited to that mission in that there's so many different avenues to address the other issues. We are not political, we are not public servants, we are a church. And so within the church, there are entities of all sorts to address those different. Yes, let me speak on that, and then I'll go to Deidre McGee, then Ray Jones, and then AJ. Yes, there's a world of knowledge, especially with the internet, and there's all sorts of things that we can learn. But is it the church's mission to talk about literacy? And so to the point, I think the topic is just disaffiliation and the United Methodist, because we're kind of getting off scope. And so, well, when you say we, I think we are knowledgeable. I've spoken to the congregation. I've spoken to people that know lots more than me. I think both Dr. Smith and Superintendent Rooks are very knowledgeable of the theology behind it.
Are you saying we're not knowledgeable about homosexuality? Okay.
Yeah. All right. So, for Charlene, your point, and let me table your point, and we'll talk about that after the meeting. But we'll go to Deidre McGee, to Ray Jones, to AJ, and then we'll have one final question.
Okay, this is one that I was asked to ask the question, and it is, what will happen to the Mountain Sky Conference? I guess after 2024, if everything stands as traditional, will the Mountain Sky Conference still exist as the Mountain Sky?
So the question is, will the Mountain Sky Conference continue to exist after 2024 if the traditional plan continues to be the Book of Discipline? So my answer is yes. The Methodist Church moves really slow. I mean, we are a huge institution, which is part of our problem. We, in many ways, are too big, but it means we move super slow. So whatever happens in 2024, it's going to take 4 or 8 years to implement whatever happens, to really kind of figure out from there what goes next. We're going to have a number of churches and clergy disaffiliate, especially denominationally. One conference, a central conference, Germany, already disaffiliated. Annual conferences in the United States cannot disaffiliate. There's different rules for conferences in the United States than conferences outside of the United States. That's a whole other conversation. But we have had one conference outside the United States disaffiliate. Yes, and more, yes, others have tried. Judicial Council has said a U.S. conference cannot. So we know there is structural change that's going to happen. We're going to lose enough money. I mean, to be honest, we're going to lose enough money that it's not going to sustain the large structure, the large organization of the United Methodist Church. In 2024, something's going to happen. But that's going to take 4 or 8 years to really see the implementation of that. So I think whatever happens in 2024, we've got another decade, probably where the local church level doesn't feel the effect a whole lot. Annual conferences might, jurisdictions might, those of us who do that kind of work will feel it. Your average congregation member sitting in a local church is probably not going to feel it for 5 to 10 years, whatever might happen.
I would say that the conference structure may change. The conference name may change. We've already seen that. It has changed. But there will be a structure that encompasses who we are now. Whether that encompasses other conferences with us, we don't know. So that's what the future is holding for us. But the United Methodist Church is not going anywhere. How it is structured will change after 2024 or even later. So the structure may change.
AJ?
Yes, that kind of piggybacks off of the structure. So if we choose to stay, virtually nothing really changes. So we can stay United Methodist. We can still preserve our conservative. If we choose not to have anybody in the LGBTQ, we can still choose to have a traditional pastor. So basically nothing changes, pretty much.
Correct.
Is that what I'm getting? Okay, that's what I want to know. We're making it seem like it's bigger than it's supposed to.
Well, the part of the reason for doing these kind of informational things is because there was so much rumor out there and so much fear that things were just going to absolutely be destroyed and blow up, that we had to start informing people of what's real and what's not.
So we choose to stay, we just kind of remain
Yes.
exactly how we've been doing for 100 plus years.
118.
118.
This year, right?
Okay. All right, that makes sense. Thank you.
So before I offer the last question to Barry, is there anyone who has a question or a thought and has not had the opportunity to speak? Yes. Can you stand up? Maybe we can hear you better.
In the instance where, just an example, if we lose Pastor Smith, he decides to retire, we are conference decides on who they're going to send us as a new pastor. If that person happens to be LG, whatever.
Yeah, can't even say
Are they? Does their situation, is it made public to the church, or is it kept secret, so nobody knows what happened? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So we are at a point now where if somebody is an out LGBTQ person, then they're out. And so we have that conversation in every appointment. If they're not out to a point that we don't know, then we don't know. But that's pretty rare.
So when they're interviewed, it's like labor laws. They are interviewed and asked that question, are you outright this or that? That's their personal belief and that's it.
So if they're out, I did an introduction this year where the clergy was male and his male husband came with him to the introduction. Well, they didn't know until the two of them walked into the introduction and everybody knew. I mean, it was just as if his wife, if he were straight and married to a woman, spouses often come. I mean, from the very beginning, we treated it like any other introduction, and he and his husband both came, and so it was very clear right away. So yes, we are committed to transparency and honesty and openness, which is why that's what we're asking of the SPRCs. Transparency and honesty and openness. We need to know what you're ready for and not ready for.
But you knew when you took them there that they were.
Right, yeah.
So, I mean, part of that is, and probably your SPPRC would know. They wouldn't know who it was, but they would know. No?
No.
Oh, that's good. Well, then things haven't changed, because my first introduction at Lions, they didn't know a black man was coming.
So that's an interesting question. I mean, we are trying to treat it like any other appointment, and we don't tell a church that we're bringing a straight person to you. So we didn't tell the church we're bringing a gay person to you. There's conversation to be had about that. Right, self-avowed, practicing. I mean, that's the language in the Book of Discipline, self-avowed practicing. Yeah, if someone is not open, then they're not open, but then they're usually not married to a same-gender person, and so you don't have those dynamics.
The other thing about an introduction, you don't have to say yes. The pastor doesn't have to say yes, but you better have a good reason if you say no. And as a DS, I had one church say no to someone when we brought them. Bishop went and talked with them, decided, okay, this person's not right for you. About 4 years later, they were asking for exactly the same kind of qualities we had tried to take them in the first place. But
final thought and final question to Brother Barry.
Yep. I know this transition is it's formal. It's going to be a formal transition because, either you're hot or you're cold. There's no middle of the line. But what about spiritually too? There's got to be spirit is all what we work around and what keeps us going is our spirit. Formal stuff it's white collar stuff. It's you know what I mean. It doesn't apply to everybody. But the spirit, once you have it, you do. Even if you don't, it's still with us. The other question I was going to ask: What about the other religions? Are we all doing this kind of simultaneously, or is it just us right now and then the Baptists next year? I understand, but I'm just saying, how are we
So
working
other
this?
denominations have already gone through this. Presbyterians, Lutherans, UCC is way ahead of us. And Catholics are not. Yeah, so what we're finding, what's really interesting in the Lutheran and the Presbyterian denomination, who are about 5 or 10 years ahead of us in this, they had a split, and many of those churches that split are asking to come back because they're discovering, and we're finding this in some of the disaffiliation conversations. We have churches who want to disaffiliate, and then they're upset when they find out they can't stay under our insurance policy. And they have to form their own nonprofit status. And they're not going to work with the conference on a clergy person when they need one. I mean, it's this kind of interesting conversation. So what does it mean to no longer be part of a denomination? Sometimes, and this especially with the WCA, part of the misinformation, the fear tactic, is to tell you that the denomination has no resource for you, that you don't benefit from being part of the denomination. You do. There is a benefit to being a part of a larger group of churches. I mean, UMCOR, that's the first thing we always lift up. UMCOR does amazing work across the globe because we as a denomination come together to serve a bigger purpose. UMCOR is our outreach branch of the denomination, and they are often a first agency in and a last agency out after disaster. They're the disaster relief. They work with the Red Cross, yeah. They're often the ones who are still there after all the other agencies have left, and boots on the ground.
Our agency is more of a case management thing, so they're going to be there long after Red Cross is gone.
That's a good way to put that. So there's amazing benefits when we come together across the globe in one denomination. We forget that because we don't often see it at the local church level. Churches that have left other denominations then begin to recognize that, and they're asking to come back. Churches through the disaffiliation process, when they understand what disaffiliation from the denomination really means, are stopping their process because they don't want to not be United Methodist. They might be on the conservative end. They might not like that we have a lesbian bishop, but when you look at big picture of what it means to be part of a denomination, they don't actually want to leave that. And so denominational affiliation means something.
One of my greatest concerns in the church split is not so much that the church is splitting, it's that the African Methodist churches, those churches in Africa, are going to be the ones that are hurt the most because we are no longer a united Methodist helping them with money and projects and stuff like that. And I think they're going to discover the churches, churches that are trying to pull the church apart have no intention of supporting them once it's broken.
The Wesleyan Covenant Association recently called for all of the traditional churches to stop giving your apportionments, mission shares, to which the bishops in Africa came out and said, you realize you're asking the denomination to stop funding ministry in Africa. The WCA has tried to recruit those same people to go WCA and has said that the Methodist Church is bad, and yet they called for stop funding churches in Africa. It's come back to hurt them, but there's a theological question to our denomination as well that isn't being talked about in this disaffiliation conversation. Unfortunately, I think it should. What theologically, where's the Spirit moving in our denomination so that we serve people all across the globe? And we do that better when we are a United Methodist Church. Big tent. When we don't make you pass a litmus test before we say we're going to come support you. It's not about the right belief. It's about the practice of grace. That's who we have always been. That's who we want to continue to be. That's what we're hoping others will say, yeah, that's what it means to be United Methodist. That's what we're going to do.
We as a United Methodist denomination are supporting projects across the world in such a way that we do it better. They actually come to us. Countries have come to us and said, can you help us with this? Nothing But Nets was one of those things.
United Nations came to us and asked us to lead it.
Nothing But Nets for malaria. Nets treated for malaria.
But literally, the United Nations came to the United Methodist Church to say, you have the resources, the structure, the networks, the connections. We could do this better with your help.
Well, I'm going to play bad cop, and I'm going to jump in and and so let's start by thanking Jessica. Thank you for your time and your use of your brain, and thank you for being a part of our worship service. So before we adjourn, our next steps will be the SPPRC will meet in October, we will meet in December, and it's my charge as chair that we have at least a recommendation to Church Council prior to the end of the year. So I need you all's help. If you need more information, if you had additional thoughts, if you know somebody who still has questions, let us know and we will accommodate them. Charlene will make an effort to address your concerns regarding education and what types of education that, the concerns that you expressed. I don't know if they're yours, but the concerns that you expressed, we will tackle all of those. But again, I need your help. That if no silent sufferers, so if you need more information, if you know someone that needs more information, there's 9 members on SPPRC. There's other members within the church that you can chat with on the phone if you need more information. So the opportunity is there, and the people just need to avail themselves to those opportunities. So with that, I want to say thank you for your time, and just a footnote. There are some goodies out there that were left over from this morning, so feel free to grab something should you see fit. And who took it? All right, we need to check Barry's car to see if he has all the donuts. But, and thank you, Reverend Smith, for a wonderful message. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, guys.